The bank statement was 11 years old, and it took me exactly 4 minutes to understand that my entire childhood had been quietly rewritten without my permission. My name is Lindsey, I'm 29, and I work as a financial analyst at a mid-size firm in Tulsa, the kind of job where I spend my days finding the one number in a spreadsheet that doesn't match the story everyone around it is telling. I'm good at it. I've always been good at it, the particular skill of sitting with a column of figures until they confess what people won't say out loud themselves. I had no idea, the morning I found that statement folded inside an old shoebox in my mother's garage, that I was about to use that exact skill on my own family. I'd driven out to my parents' house in Bartlesville that Saturday to help my mother sort through decades of accumulated clutter before a planned downsizing, boxes of photo albums, my father's old fishing gear, a filing cabinet nobody had opened since the Clinton administration. My brother Tyler was supposed to help too. Tyler is 32, 2.5 years older than me, and he had, predictably, texted that morning to say something had come up at the shop. The shop. Tyler's auto restoration business, the one my parents had been telling everyone about for 3 years now with a pride so specific and so total that I'd started, without quite admitting it to myself, to feel a small flinch every time his name came up at dinner. Tyler's really found his calling. Tyler's finally figured out what he wants. Have you seen the shop, Lindsey? You should really go see the shop. I'd gone, once, the year it opened. A converted warehouse on the edge of town, gleaming concrete floors, a row of half-restored classic cars under work lights. Tyler had walked me through it with his hands in his pockets, talking about margins and parts sourcing in a voice I didn't entirely recognize, careful and rehearsed in a way that should have told me something even then. I'd told him it looked great. I'd meant it, mostly. I had no reason, that day, to ask the question that would have changed everything: where, exactly, had the seed money for all of this actually come from? My mother, Denise, 58, had handed me the shoebox almost as an afterthought, mid-sentence about a stack of old tax returns we needed to shred. "These are just some old papers from when you kids were little," she said. "Bank stuff, I think. You're better with numbers than I am, just check there's nothing important before we toss it." I sat down on an overturned milk crate in that garage, dust drifting gold through the one-high window, and started sorting. Old certificates of deposit. A passbook savings account from a bank that didn't exist anymore. And then, near the bottom, a statement with my name on it, Lindsey M. Caraway, Education Trust, dated the year I turned 18, showing a balance of $41,300. I remembered that account. I'd been told, at 17, sitting at our kitchen table while my parents explained how college would work, that the fund existed, that it had been growing since I was a baby, that it would cover most of my tuition if I was careful about where I applied. I'd been careful. I'd gone to Oklahoma State on a partial scholarship and a stack of loans I was still, 12 years later, paying off in monthly installments that ate a real chunk of my paycheck. I had never once seen this statement. I had never been shown a closing balance. By the time I'd actually needed the money, my parents had told me, gently, almost apologetically, that the market had been rough that year, that the fund hadn't grown the way they'd hoped, that there simply wasn't as much there as they'd once expected. I flipped to the next page in the shoebox, an account summary from 3 years later, the exact year Tyler's shop had opened. The balance was zero. A withdrawal, the full $41,300, transferred in a single transaction to an account I recognized immediately, because I'd seen its routing number 100 times on invoices Tyler had once shown me with such pride. Caraway Restoration, LLC. I sat very still on that milk crate for a long time, the statement trembling slightly in my hands, the garage suddenly too quiet around me. Somewhere inside the house, I could hear my mother humming along to the radio, sorting through photo albums with no idea that the daughter she'd sent into the garage to check there's nothing important had just found the single most important document of her entire adult life. I had no idea, sitting there, that within 3 weeks I would be standing in my parents' dining room on Thanksgiving, the same statement in my hand, watching my mother's face do something I had never once seen it do in 29 years, And that what came after would finally answer a question I'd been too afraid to ask my entire life, whether being the daughter who never needed anything had actually ever been a choice I'd made, or simply the only role anyone had left for me to play. I didn't say anything that Saturday. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to imagine I confronted someone the moment I found it, and that isn't what happened. I folded the statement back into the shoebox, finished sorting the rest of the papers, and drove home to Tulsa with my hand steady on the wheel and something cold sitting low in my stomach that I couldn't yet name. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A loan, maybe, that I simply hadn't been told about, something temporary, repaid quietly in the years since. I'd grown up believing my parents were careful with money, even conservative. My father, Gary, had spent 30 years as a high school shop teacher, the kind of man who reused tinfoil and drove the same truck for 2 decades. The idea that they'd simply handed my entire education fund to my brother and let me believe the market had eaten it felt, that first night, almost too strange to be real. I called my mother 3 days later, easing into it the way I always eased into anything that might create friction. "Hey, I was going through some old stuff from the garage," I said. "Found an old account statement with my name on it. Education trust thing. Do you know what happened with that?" There was a pause on her end, not long, but long enough that I noticed it. "Oh, that old thing," she said. "You know the market took a hit right around when you needed it. We told you that years ago, honey." "I found a later statement too," I said, keeping my voice even, the careful, neutral tone I use at work when I'm walking a client through a number they don't want to hear. "Showing a transfer to Tyler's business account." Another pause, this one longer. "We helped your brother get the shop off the ground," she said, her voice taking on a brisk, slightly defensive edge I recognized from 100 other conversations over the years. The tone she used whenever Tyler's name came up alongside anything that sounded like scrutiny. "That fund wasn't doing anything for anyone sitting in a bank account, Lindsey. At least this way it actually built something." I let it go. I told her I understood, that I was just curious, that it made sense. I hung up the phone and sat on my couch for a long time afterward, feeling something I couldn't fully name, not yet anger, something quieter and more disorienting. The specific vertigo of discovering that a story you've told yourself your whole life has a hole in it you never noticed before. Eric noticed something was off before I said anything to him directly. My boyfriend of 3 years, the kind of steady, observant presence who reads a room the way I read a balance sheet, found me staring at nothing over dinner that week and finally asked, "Where'd you go just now?" "Nowhere," I said. "Just tired." I didn't tell him about the statement that night. I told myself I needed more information before I made it real by saying it out loud, but the truer reason, the one I wouldn't fully understand until much later, was that some old, stubborn part of me still needed this to be a misunderstanding rather than a betrayal, and saying it out loud to someone who loved me would make it impossible to keep believing that. I called Marin that weekend, my best friend since college, the person who'd talked me through every difficult decision of my adult life, the closest thing I had to a sister of my own choosing. "It's probably nothing," I told her, even as I described the statement in detail. "Maybe there's context I'm missing." "That doesn't sound like nothing," Marin said. "That sounds like they took your money and gave it to your brother and let you take out loans instead." Hearing her say it plainly, stripped of the softening language I'd been using even in my own head, landed harder than I expected. I felt my throat tighten, the specific tightness that comes right before tears you're trying to talk yourself out of. "I don't know," I said. "I don't want to blow this up over something that might have a reasonable explanation." "You're allowed to ask for the reasonable explanation," Marin said. "That's not blowing anything up." I told her she was right. I didn't, that week, actually ask for anything more. The first real crack came at a smaller family dinner 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, just my parents, Tyler, and me, the kind of low-key Sunday meal we'd done for years. Tyler was talking about expanding the shop, a second location he was hoping to open in Owasso, the kind of expansion that would require, he said, another round of investment. My father, usually the quietest person at any table, glanced at my mother in a way I'd never quite seen him do before, a small, searching look, gone almost before I registered it, the kind of glance you give someone when you're checking whether a particular subject is safe to continue standing near. My mother changed the topic almost immediately, asking Tyler about his girlfriend's upcoming birthday instead. I noticed it. I filed it away the way I'd been filing things away my whole life, under the heading of probably nothing, and didn't yet understand what I'd actually witnessed. My father, for one unguarded second, anxious about a subject my mother had clearly told him to leave alone. That detail seemed insignificant at the time. It wasn't. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever asked a careful, gentle question and gotten back an answer that technically addressed the words but somehow left the actual question untouched, you know exactly what that phone call with my mother felt like. You don't always recognize, in the moment, that you've just been redirected. You just notice, afterward, that you still don't actually know what you wanted to know. I spent the 2 weeks before Thanksgiving doing the thing I am, professionally, very good at: pulling numbers, building a picture, letting the data tell me what people weren't willing to say. I requested copies of the original trust documents from the bank, a process that took longer than I expected and required more identity verification than I'd anticipated, given that the account had technically been mine the entire time. I found, buried in the original trust paperwork, language I'd never been shown, a provision allowing my parents, as custodians, full discretion over fund usage for the benefit of the family, a clause broad enough, I now understood with a sinking clarity, to justify almost anything. I didn't show anyone what I'd found yet. Not Eric, not Marin, not my parents. I told myself I was simply being thorough, gathering the full picture before I said anything to anyone. The same instinct that made me good at my job applied now, for the first time, to my own family. I had no idea, 2 weeks out from Thanksgiving, that the full picture I was building would turn out to include something far more painful than a single redirected fund, and that the person who would eventually help me understand the deeper history behind it all wasn't going to be my mother, or my father, but my Aunt Carol, the one person in this family who had apparently been watching this pattern unfold for far longer than I had. I almost told Tyler everything on a Tuesday night, 10 days before Thanksgiving, in a moment I still think about more than almost any other in this entire story. He'd called out of nowhere, something he rarely did, his voice carrying an unusual warmth that caught me off guard. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks," he said. "For always being the one who shows up, you know? Mom and Dad don't say it enough, but I notice. You're a good sister." I sat with the phone against my ear, the trust documents still open on my laptop screen in front of me, the language about parental discretion still glowing there in black and white, and felt something rise in my throat, not affection exactly, something closer to grief for a version of this conversation that could have existed if any of it had been built on honesty. I had the truth right there, ready, the exact sentence that would have changed everything between us in an instant. "Tyler, did you know your shop was funded with my college money?" I didn't say it. I told him it meant a lot to hear that I loved him too, and let the moment pass into something smaller and safer than what it could have been. It cost me something, choosing silence in that moment, not immediately, but in the weeks that followed, when I found myself unable to look at Tyler's excitement about the Owasso expansion without a private, corrosive resentment I hadn't given him any fair chance to address. I'd protected him from a conversation that might have actually changed something, and in protecting him, I'd also quietly poisoned every interaction we had after it without his knowledge or consent. I called Aunt Carol the following weekend, my father's older sister, a woman I'd always liked without ever being especially close to. She lived 2 hours away in Pawhuska and had a reputation in the family, gently mocked at holidays, for remembering everything, whether you want her to or not. I told her, carefully, what I'd found. There was a long silence on her end before she spoke. "I wondered if this would eventually come out," she said. "I should have said something to you years ago, Lindsey, and I didn't, and I think that's its own kind of failure on my part." "Said something about what?" "About your mother," Carol said, "and her own father." Your grandfather, Wendell, well, that's not relevant, wrong family, sorry, I'm thinking of someone else's mess. Let me start over. She laughed, a short, tired sound. Your mother grew up the older of two kids in a family that didn't have much. Her younger brother, your Uncle Mike, was the one everyone fussed over, sickly as a kid, needed more, got more, and your mother learned early that the way you stayed loved in that house was by needing nothing at all. She was proud of how little she needed. She still is. I think somewhere along the way she decided that being needed by someone, really needed, financially, completely, was the closest thing to love she actually understood. And then Tyler came along struggling with something, anything, every few years, and she got to be the one who fixed it, over and over, and I don't think she ever stopped to ask herself whether that was healthy for either of you. I sat with that for a long moment, the pieces shifting into a shape I hadn't expected. That doesn't make it okay, I finally said. No, Carol agreed. It doesn't. I'm not telling you this to excuse her. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to understand the why before you walk into whatever conversation you're planning to have. I thanked her, and we talked a while longer about other things, and I hung up feeling both more equipped and more unsettled than before the call. She told me, much later, Carol did, over coffee months after everything had settled, what she'd actually been carrying that same week, debating whether to call my mother first. This is what Carol told me. I almost called Denise before you, to warn her you'd found it. I sat with my phone in my hand for almost 20 minutes. I told myself I was protecting the family by giving her a chance to get ahead of it, to control how it came out. But somewhere in those 20 minutes, I understood that protecting the family had become this family's excuse for almost everything painful it had ever buried, and I didn't want to be one more person adding to that pile. So I put the phone down. I decided, if this was finally going to come out, it should come out on your terms, Lindsey, not hers. That's what Carol told me. I knew none of it at the time, I only knew, hanging up that first phone call, that I finally had context I hadn't had before, and that context didn't make me angrier. It made me sadder, in a way I hadn't expected. The behavioral signs from my mother kept escalating in the days that followed, small things I noticed and, at the time, still mostly misread. She called twice that week for reasons that didn't quite hold up, once to ask, almost too casually, whether I'd found anything interesting in the garage boxes, a question she tried to bury inside a longer conversation about Thanksgiving menu planning. When I said only that I'd found some old paperwork, nothing important, I heard something in her exhale that sounded almost like relief, though I couldn't have told you, in that moment, exactly why. I want to pause here, because some of you already know this feeling. The one where you start gathering proof not because you've decided what you're going to do with it, but because not knowing the full shape of something has become harder to carry than knowing ever could be. 3 nights before Thanksgiving, lying awake beside Eric, my mind running the same loop it had been running for weeks, I finally told him everything: the statement, the transfer, the trust documents, Carol's explanation of my mother's history. He listened without interrupting, his hand finding mine in the dark partway through. "What are you going to do?" he asked, when I finished. "I don't know yet," I said, which was true. I think I need to see what they actually say, in person, before I decide anything. I had the original statement in a folder on my kitchen counter, photocopied twice for safety, the trust documents clipped behind it. I told myself I would bring it to Thanksgiving only if the moment called for it, that I wasn't planning a confrontation, just preparing, the way I prepared for any difficult client meeting, for a conversation that might or might not need hard evidence on the table. I had no real plan for what would happen if Tyler brought up the Owasso expansion again, in front of everyone, the way he had at every family gathering for the past month. I had no idea, driving to Bartlesville on Thanksgiving morning with that folder in my bag, that he was about to do exactly that, and that this time, unlike every other time before it, I would not be able to let it pass. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and unseasonably warm, the kind of Oklahoma November day that can't decide what season it actually wants to be. I drove to Bartlesville with the folder sitting on the passenger seat, Eric beside me, his hand resting once, briefly, on my knee at a red light, not a question, just a small, steady acknowledgement that he knew what I might be carrying into that house. The morning unfolded the way Thanksgiving always did at my parents', my mother orchestrating the kitchen with practiced efficiency, my father quietly watching football with the volume too low to actually hear, Tyler arriving late with his girlfriend Brianna and a bottle of wine he announced, twice, had cost more than it probably should have. I noticed my mother's hands that morning in a way I hadn't before, small, repetitive movements at the counter, refolding a dish towel that didn't need refolding, checking the oven timer more often than the actual cooking required. She'd never struck me, in 29 years, as a nervous woman. Something in her had come slightly loose, though I still didn't have language yet for exactly what I was watching. Sleep had been difficult the past several nights, my appetite strange and unreliable, the food on my plate that morning sitting mostly untouched while I made conversation I barely remember having. My chest had gone tight more than once that week, before opening doors, before answering my mother's calls, a physical weight I recognized from nowhere in my own life until this. I told myself, more than once, that I was overthinking what was, ultimately, still just a family dinner. The conversation turned, as I'd known it eventually would, toward the Owasso expansion sometime after the turkey had been carved, while everyone was still settling at the table. Tyler was animated, talking about square footage and projected revenue, and my father asked, with what sounded like genuine pride, how much additional capital the expansion would require. "We're looking at securing another loan," Tyler said, "but honestly, the way the first round of funding worked out, I'm hoping family might be willing to help bridge part of it again." The word again landed in that room like something dropped from a height. I felt my mother's eyes flick toward me, fast, almost imperceptible, and understood, in that single glance, that she knew exactly what again referred to, and that some part of her had been quietly hoping I wouldn't be the one to make that word mean anything at this particular table. "What do you mean, again?" Brianna asked, innocently, the question of someone who genuinely didn't know the history sitting underneath the conversation. Did family help fund the first shop too? It was such a small, ordinary question, the kind anyone might ask, with no agenda attached to it at all, and it landed in that room like a single-struck match held too close to something already soaked in gasoline. I watched my mother's face do something complicated, watched my father set down his fork with unusual care, watched Tyler glance toward our parents, suddenly less certain than he'd sounded 30 seconds earlier. I had the folder in my bag, sitting against my chair leg, exactly as it had sat there since I'd walked in that morning. I felt the old, familiar pull toward letting this pass, toward smiling, changing the subject, protecting the dinner the way I'd protected every family dinner my entire life. I felt, underneath that pull, something newer and colder rising to meet it. I came close, in that moment, to simply answering Brianna's question honestly, right there, no preparation, no plan, and then I stopped myself, watching my mother's face, understanding that doing it this way, unplanned, in front of Tyler's girlfriend of 8 months, would cost something I wasn't ready to spend. I wanted Tyler to hear this from me directly, not stumble into it sideways because of an innocent question from someone who had no idea what she'd just touched. "It's a long story," I said instead, my voice even. "Let's talk about it after dinner." My mother exhaled, visibly, a small release of tension I registered and, in the moment, still mostly misread as simple relief that an awkward subject had passed. I would understand later, far later, that it hadn't been relief at avoiding embarrassment in front of Brianna. It had been relief that I'd apparently decided, after all, to keep protecting her the way I always had. She was wrong about that, though she had no way of knowing it yet. After dinner, while my mother and Brianna cleared dishes and Tyler and my father carried the folding tables back to the garage, I found a quiet moment alone in the kitchen and finally allowed myself to look directly at what I'd actually been carrying for 3 weeks. Not just the betrayal of the money itself, but the deeper, harder truth underneath it, that some part of me had spent my entire life mistaking my own usefulness for my own worth. I had been the daughter who never asked for anything, the one who held things together, the one Carol had described in her own mother decades earlier, and I understood now, standing in that kitchen, That I had built an entire identity around being needed precisely because needing nothing felt like the only currency this family had ever taught me was safe to spend. I had spent years being good at the wrong things, at not asking, at making everything look fine, at being the reliable one so consistently that nobody, including me, had ever stopped to ask whether reliability and love were actually the same thing. I went out to the garage where my father and Tyler were folding tables, and asked my father, quietly, if he had a minute. He looked at me, something careful and slightly frightened crossing his face, the same look I'd caught at that earlier Sunday dinner, the one that told me he'd known, on some level, that this conversation was coming for longer than I'd realized. "Did you know," I said, keeping my voice low enough that Tyler, a few feet away, couldn't hear, that my entire education trust was transferred into Tyler's business account the year the shop opened? My father's face went pale in a way that answered the question before he said a single word. "Lindsey," he said. Your mother handled the financial side of things." I knew there was a transfer. I didn't know the full amount until much later. I should have asked more questions. I've regretted not asking more questions for a long time. It wasn't a confession exactly. It was closer to an admission of his own quiet complicity, the particular, familiar cowardice of a man who had spent decades choosing peace over honesty and was only now, standing in a cold garage on Thanksgiving, beginning to understand what that choice had actually cost. I told him I appreciated him being honest with me right now, and I meant it, even as I understood it had taken him almost 3 decades to manage it. I didn't confront my mother that evening. I drove home with Eric in the early dark, the folder still unopened in my bag, having decided, somewhere in that quiet kitchen, that whatever conversation needed to happen next would happen on my terms, deliberately, not stumbled into sideways by an innocent question from someone who didn't yet understand what she'd almost uncovered. I had no idea, driving home that night, that the moment I'd decided to delay would arrive again, in full, only 4 weeks later, at my mother's 60th birthday dinner, in front of nearly everyone who mattered to her, and that this time, there would be no graceful way left to say let's talk about it after dinner. My mother's 60th birthday dinner happened at a banquet hall just outside Bartlesville, the kind of venue she'd wanted for years and finally gotten: round tables, a small dance floor. Nearly 40 guests including cousins and old church friends and neighbors who'd known our family for decades. She believed, walking into that room in a new dress she'd shown me proudly over the phone the week before, that this night belonged entirely to her, on her own carefully managed terms. Tyler stood to give a toast about halfway through dinner, the kind of warm, rehearsed speech he was good at, thanking our parents for everything they'd given him over the years, especially, he said, raising his glass, the support that got the shop off the ground when nobody else believed it could work. I felt my chest tighten, the specific physical weight I'd been carrying for weeks finally arriving at the moment it had clearly been building toward all along. I looked at my mother, glowing under the soft banquet lighting, accepting Tyler's gratitude like the most natural thing in the world, and understood, with total clarity, that she had no idea this particular toast was about to become the last comfortable moment of her evening. I stood up when Tyler sat down, the folder in my hands, my heart loud enough that I could hear it in the sudden quiet of my own ears. "I'd like to say something too," I said. "About that support." The room turned toward me with the easy, generous attention of people expecting a sweet addition to an already sweet toast. I felt that attention shift, almost immediately, into something more uncertain as I opened the folder instead of simply speaking. 11 years ago, I had a college education trust with my name on it, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. $41,300. I was told the market had taken a hit and there wasn't much left by the time I needed it for school. I took out loans instead, loans I'm still paying off today. I set the original statement on the table in front of me, then the transfer record beside it. This is the account statement showing the balance the year I turned 18. And this is the transfer record showing the entire amount moved into Caraway Restoration, LLC, 3 years later, the same year Tyler's shop opened. The room had gone completely, totally silent, the specific silence of 40 people sensing, all at once, that something real had just interrupted a celebration they'd been invited to enjoy. My mother's face changed in a way I had never once seen it change in 29 years, not anger first, something closer to panic, quickly papered over with a brittle, practiced calm. "This isn't the time, Lindsey," she said, her voice low and tight. "We can discuss family matters privately." "You've had 3 weeks since I found this to discuss it privately," I said. "You knew I knew. You asked me, 2 weeks ago, whether I'd found anything interesting in the garage, and when I said no, you sounded relieved. I think you were hoping I'd just keep doing what I always do, which is let it go." "You don't understand the whole picture," she said, her composure cracking slightly at the edges now, color rising in her face. "Tyler needed that money. He was struggling, he needed a chance, and you were always so capable, Lindsey, you never needed anyone's help with anything. We thought. You thought I wouldn't notice," I said. "Or that I wouldn't say anything even if I did. Both of those things were true for 11 years. I'm done with both of them tonight." Tyler had gone very pale beside Brianna, his glass still half raised from his own toast. "Mom," he said slowly, "is this true? Is this what funded the shop?" My mother didn't answer him directly. Instead, something in her finally gave way completely, the practiced calm dissolving into something rawer, the kind of honesty that only arrives once every other option has been exhausted. "You want to understand," she said, turning to face the room more fully now, her voice shaking but somehow gaining strength as she spoke. "Fine. I'll tell you. I grew up the older sister of a brother everyone fussed over, sick as a child, fragile, needing constant attention, and I learned, very young, that the way you stayed loved in a house like that was by needing absolutely nothing yourself. I was proud of how little I needed. I built my whole identity around it. And then I had 2 children of my own, and one of them turned out exactly like me, capable, self-sufficient, never asking for anything, and the other one struggled, the way my brother had struggled, and some old, broken part of me recognized that struggle and rushed toward it the same way I'd watched everyone rush toward my brother my whole childhood. I told myself I was simply being a good mother to Tyler. I didn't let myself see, for years, that being a good mother to him meant treating you, Lindsey, as someone who simply didn't require the same care, because you'd never once, not since you were a little girl, given me any reason to think otherwise. I used your money because some part of me genuinely believed you'd be fine without it. You always were fine. That's exactly the problem, isn't it? I mistook your strength for permission. I have thought about this account 100 times over the years, and every single time, I told myself the same thing: she's fine, she doesn't need it, Tyler needs it more, and I never once stopped to ask whether that was actually true, or whether I'd simply decided it was true because it let me keep doing what I needed to do. I don't know how to undo 11 years of telling myself that story. I don't know if I even fully understood, until this exact moment, standing here in front of everyone I know, how much it actually cost you to let me keep believing it. The room had gone completely still by the time she finished, my father's eyes wet, Tyler standing frozen beside his chair, his glass finally, slowly, set back down on the table. It was Tyler who spoke next, his voice cracking in a way I had never once heard from him. "I didn't know," he said. "Lindsey, I swear to you, I never knew it was your money specifically. Mom told me it was family savings, general funds. I would never have." He stopped, something shifting behind his eyes as he looked at our mother. "Would I have asked more questions if I'd known? I don't know. I should have asked more questions regardless. I just believed what I was told, the same way I always have." Brianna had gone very quiet beside him, her hand finding his arm, not in comfort exactly, more in the careful, steadying way of someone recalibrating everything she thought she understood about the family she was dating into. "I didn't raise my voice through any of this. I want you to understand that, because some part of me had walked into that banquet hall braced for an explosion, and instead I found myself simply standing very still, watching my mother's carefully built story finally collapse in front of nearly everyone she loved, and feeling something quieter than anger settle into its place, the specific, total clarity of finally seeing, without any remaining doubt, Exactly what this family had decided about me a long time before I'd had any say in it. I believe almost everything you just said, I told my mother. I even understand some of it. But I'm not standing here tonight to forgive you, and I'm not staying to help manage how this looks to everyone in this room. I think you owe me money you've spent 11 years pretending didn't exist, and I think you owe Tyler an honest conversation about what he's actually built his business on. Those are two different conversations, and neither one of them needs to happen at your birthday dinner. I picked up the folder, left the statement and transfer record on the table where everyone could still see them, and walked out of that banquet hall into the cold parking lot, Eric a half step behind me. The December air sharp enough to make my eyes water in a way that had nothing, this time, to do with crying. I didn't speak to my mother for almost 2 months after that night. Not out of punishment, exactly, though for a while I had to sit honestly with the possibility that it was, until I understood it was something simpler. I no longer had anything automatic to offer her, the easy reflexive reassurance I'd been offering my entire life, and I needed the silence to find out what, if anything, might eventually replace it. Tyler called the week after the birthday dinner, his voice steadier than I'd heard it in years. I talked to a lawyer, he said. About the business structure. I want to make this right somehow, even if it takes years. I don't know exactly what that looks like yet, but I wanted you to know I'm not pretending this didn't happen. It wasn't restitution. It was, at least, the first honest thing he'd offered me since Brianna's innocent question had cracked the whole evening open, and I told him I appreciated it, and meant it. My father called every Sunday after that, a new habit, careful and a little stilted, mostly about nothing, the weather, a fishing trip, a show he'd started watching. It was small. It was also the first thing he'd ever offered me entirely on his own, without my mother standing somewhere behind it directing the conversation. My mother and I finally spoke in February, over coffee at a diner halfway between Tulsa and Bartlesville, neutral ground neither of us had ever tried before. She didn't ask for forgiveness outright. What she said instead was, I don't know how to be the kind of mother who notices a child before that child has to make herself impossible to ignore. I'm 60 years old, and I'm only just now understanding that I built that habit before I even had children, and I passed it down to you without meaning to, the same way it was passed down to me. It wasn't absolution. It was, at least, an honest accounting, more than she'd ever offered before, and more than I'd expected to receive that morning. I worked with Joan, a different Joan than the one I'd later learn other people's stories involved, simply my own family attorney here in Tulsa, to formalize a repayment arrangement with my mother, modest monthly payments stretched across several years, structured the way I structure everything, carefully, with clear terms neither of us could later pretend had been ambiguous. It wasn't about the money by then, not entirely. It was about having, finally, something in writing that acknowledged plainly what had actually happened. I think about that morning in the garage more than I expected to, even now, the dust drifting gold through that one high window, the particular cold that moved through me reading a balance of zero where $41,000 should have been. I understand now that I wasn't only grieving the money, though the money mattered more than I'd let myself admit for years while paying down loans it should never have been necessary for me to take out. I was grieving a version of myself I'd built without ever consciously choosing it, the daughter who needed nothing, who held everything together, who mistook being useful for being loved, because somewhere along the way, nobody had ever shown me a difference between the two. I don't think I'll ever fully trust my mother with anything that matters as completely as I once did. I've stopped needing to. What I have instead is steadier, and smaller, and entirely my own, a career I built without anyone's help, a brother slowly learning to ask harder questions, and a quiet, hard-won understanding that being the one who never asks for anything was never, actually, the same thing as being someone people had genuinely seen. The hardest thing to reconcile about Denise isn't that she favored one child over the other, that particular failure is almost painfully common, the kind of imbalance most families carry in some form. It's that she had 30 years of evidence, watching her own daughter quietly absorb every unmet need without complaint, and mistook that silence for confirmation rather than for what it actually was, a child who had learned, far too early, that asking for help simply wasn't a language this family rewarded. What makes her confession in that banquet hall so unsettling in hindsight isn't dishonesty, it's the opposite. She genuinely believed, for over a decade, that Lindsey's competence was permission rather than performance. That belief wasn't malice. It was a blindness built from her own childhood, inherited and then passed forward without ever once being examined, the kind of generational pattern that survives precisely because nobody in it stops long enough to ask whether the story they're telling themselves is actually true or simply convenient. The deeper collapse in this story belongs to Gary, though more quietly than to Denise. His failure was never active cruelty, it was the slow, accumulating cost of decades spent choosing peace over honesty, watching financial decisions happen around him and telling himself that not asking questions was the same as not being responsible for the answers. That kind of passive complicity rarely announces itself as betrayal. It simply waits, patiently, until someone else finally forces the conversation he should have started years earlier. The real reckoning in this story belongs to Lindsey, though, and it isn't really about the money at all, even though the money is what finally made the pattern visible. It's the recognition that her own identity, the reliable one, the strong one, the daughter who never needed anything, had never actually been a neutral fact about who she was. It was a role she'd been assigned so early and so consistently that she'd stopped recognizing it as a role at all. The question this story leaves behind isn't really about Denise's favoritism. It's about how many of us mistake being needed for being loved, and how long it can take to notice that those two things, however similar they look from the outside, were never actually the same currency at all. I think about that 1 second at Thanksgiving more than almost anything else, the moment Brianna asked an innocent question with no idea what was underneath it, and I chose to protect everyone else in that room instead of myself. That's the part of this story that still catches me sometimes, how instinctive it is, after years of practice, to manage everyone else's comfort before you've even considered your own. If you've ever been the one in your family who simply never asked for anything, and quietly told yourself that was strength, rather than the only role anyone had ever actually offered you, I hope something in this story reached you. You're allowed to need things. You're allowed to let a silence sit uncomfortably instead of filling it yourself, the way you always have. If there's someone in your life who taught you that being needed was the same as being loved, tell me one word for them in the comments. I read every one. And thank you, genuinely, for staying with me through this one. It took me a long time to be able to tell it out loud, and it means something that you were here for it.